Hi, Noam.
Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I am good. I'm just making sure this is recording, which it is. So why don't we introduce ourselves? I'm Noam Scheiber. I'm a writer here at the New Republic.
And I'm Stephen Spruiell. I'm a writer here at National Review.
Great. Well, I think one of the topics we wanted to start off with was Paul Krugman, the subject of a recent piece of yours, which I read with interest. I'm a big fan of all sort of Krugman. I don't know what the name, if this were like an academic discipline, would be, but
Krugmanology.
Krugmanology. Okay, let's go with that. So why don't you just take us through your thesis and some of the points you made in the piece, and then we can kind of jump into it.
Sure. Well, the piece, rather than being sort of a profile of him, was I approached it as a review of his public, non-academic writing. So, reviewing, the stuff that he wrote before he became a New York Times columnist, and then going through the 10 years and slightly over 1,000 columns that he's written for the New York Times. And just tracing his evolution from the first kinds of columns that he wrote were very contrarian, sort of taking on economic myths and tropes that were near and dear to both left and right. He would go after naive supply-siders in one column, and then in the next he would explode a lot of the economic ideas that were guiding the anti-globalization movement, which in the late 90s was much more influential than it is today. Although with the legislation that just passed the House aimed at forcing China to revalue its currency, we're seeing a little bit of protectionism rear its head, as happens during hard economic times. But in any case, he went from that kind of iconoclastic, idiosyncratic columnist to being a very, very partisan critic of the Bush administration, and then I tried to kind of discern from his public statements, without a lot of speculation about his motives, why he did that. And if you just read what he's said about why he was kind of radicalized by the Bush years, he offers a couple of reasons. One that I don't find persuasive at all, and one that I find very persuasive. The one that I don't find persuasive is the reason that he gives, which is that Bush lied so often and told such big lies to justify his tax cuts, that this shocked Krugman into a very radical position, and he spent column after column documenting the ways in which Bush was lying to sell his tax cut. Okay, so I don't find that very persuasive, because first of all, you would have to be very naive indeed not to expect a certain amount of hyperbole from a politician selling a favored point of view. Specifically, the charge against Bush was that he was exaggerating CBO estimates of how big the surplus was likely to be. I think we all know now that the CBO was misguided in estimating that the surpluses over the next 10 years would be so large. They were making assumptions that were based on the idea that the NASDAQ bubble would never burst, and that Congress would spend more or less at the rate that it was scheduled to spend, and by that time it was kind of clear that the GOP had lost its nerve on spending. They had attributed some of their losses in 96 and 98 to the idea that the public just wasn't ready for lower spending, and so they decided to cut taxes and keep spending a lot of money on the theory that first that there was a surplus, and then second that deficits didn't matter. But when Obama was selling his health care plan, I mean, some of the shenanigans that the Democrats were using in terms of massaging and gaming the CBO estimates in order to get the score that they wanted were just as bad, if not worse, than anything that the Bush administration did in selling its tax cut. And Krugman was forbearing of a great deal of political dishonesty when it came to a policy that he favored. So I thought that was a bit disingenuous as far as a reason for why he became so strident. I think the more persuasive reason is that he, along with a lot of liberals, in the early part of the last decade, decided that they needed to fight dirtier in order to beat the right at its own game, that they didn't have anybody who was as underhanded or as stridently partisan as Karl Rove, or they didn't have their own Fox News. They didn't have a think tank like you have now, the Center for American Progress, which whose let's just say the activist side of their think tank, the C4 side for people who are fluent in the Washingtonese of various nonprofit tax statuses. Plays a much bigger role in the public debate than their C3 or their just kind of think tank side. So I think Krugman's public statements indicate that he very much bought into that. He praised David Brock, he praised Michael Moore, and loved Fahrenheit 9/11, even though he acknowledged that it took a lot of liberties with the with the facts, but still and yet, told very important truths about the Bush administration. And so, I think it was more like, look, these right-wingers are willing to get bare-knuckled and dirty and kind of fight with a no-holds-barred style. We need to do the same thing, and that's why I'm going to call the president a liar over and over and over again, when really he's just talking about, he's using CBO estimates, which is something that every politician does to justify their own policy. So that was my take on Krugman and how he became such a bare-knuckled partisan. And then there was some other stuff I wrote about his recent stimulus advocacy, but we can get into that. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what you thought about all that.
So I read the piece with great interest. I definitely think there's something to what you say. I think that you probably downplay the radicalization thesis a bit. I would give it a decent amount of credence. So on two issues in particular, I don't think it's just the tax cut, so that was obviously significant. It almost became a running theme. I think he was the guy who coined fuzzy math, and I remember going to a Halloween party, a TNR Halloween party, and late October of 2000, and there were multiple people who came dressed as funny math, which is it's a testament to two things: the complete dorkiness of watching the Halloween parties, but also Krugman's success in getting this term out just by sheer volume and repetition. So so he was definitely on this thing. There's no question about that. But I think it wasn't just the taxes. I think it was a couple of other things. I think it was the Iraq War. Was very much a radicalizing experience for him. I think he was largely right about the war. He was deeply skeptical from the beginning, and and what I'm about to say next, I think, gets to the heart of his radicalization, both on the tax code and the war, on other things like the administration and science. I think that Krugman was reacting as much to the media as to Bush and the Bush administration itself. I think his frustration with the tax cut wasn't so much that Bush was fudging the numbers, but that was certainly part of his frustration. I think his frustration, his bigger frustration was, or at least an equal frustration, was it was fairly obvious, and we wrote a lot about it, my colleague John Shade did at the same time in 2000, as did Krugman, that Bush had some fairly radical ideas. It was a very large tax cut. In kind of GDP terms, it was close in line with the first Reagan tax cut once he kind of walked some things back in the subsequent tax reforms, which created deficits for a good decade and a half. So this was a fairly radical proposal. He had a Social Security privatization proposal, which was also very radical, which was obviously subsequently repudiated kind of in the second term politically. And I think Bush and my colleague I think Krugman and my colleague John Shade saw that this guy actually had a reasonably radical agenda, and yet the media would kind of do these touchy-feely stories about how he was this, moderate from Texas who got along with Democrats and Republicans and really was just kind of, wanted to make some changes at the margins. But basically, he loved education and he loved, minorities, and he surrounded himself with them at every opportunity, and was just a good guy, and that the sort of the media was kind of mistaking character for ideology, and I think that was the media was very much focused on this characterological analysis, which may have been true. He maybe was a good guy, sort of good guy to hang out with, but was proposing a fairly radical agenda. And I think that's where Krugman's frustration and radicalization came in. Not just the facts and the substance of the program, but the way that he was able to kind of slide in under the radar a bit. This was not something that was unique to just one part of the ideological spectrum. I mean, you had a whole bunch of people who voted for Ralph Nader because they thought that there wasn't much of a difference between Bush and Al Gore. And I think it's safe to say that, whatever you think about Gore, their presidencies would probably look pretty differently. Pretty different. Gore, on the war, on budget-related stuff. So I do think that was a lot of the frustration. And then, again, on the media's coverage of Iraq, I do think there was a widespread conventional wisdom in the media that, Saddam Hussein was a really bad guy and had weapons of mass destruction, and that the Bush case just wasn't sufficiently scrutinized. And I think he was actually right about that. Well,
that's true, but I would just interject here that I think having reviewed and read almost everything that he wrote for the Times,
which is a heroic undertaking. 1,000 columns is
yeah, I asked for a hazard pay after that, but no, the Krugman persona that we all know and love now, that would easily be recognizable now, had really hardened prior to the administration making its case for war. And in fact, I think more radicalizing than anything Bush said to sell his tax cuts prior to 9/11 was the fact that after 9/11 there was the question of how to stimulate the economy, right? It's amazing because the debate they were having at the time involved much smaller numbers, but would be recognizable to somebody who lived through the 2009 stimulus debate, as if that was a long time ago. That's a funny way to say it, but the fact is that Krugman, after 9/11, when it became clear that this was an event that would hasten the collapse of the NASDAQ bubble and really lead to a real recession, a deep one, was to call for the same exact kind of composition of stimulus that he called for after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. He wanted bailouts for state governments. He wanted to kind of pad and enhance transfer payments that kick in when people lose their jobs, both on the unemployment side and the medical side, and he wanted large public works. And in fact, he was very happy that was going to be one of the outcomes. And when he saw Bush and Cheney calling for more tax relief to stimulate the economy, of course, this is just a basic ideological difference between people who see the world and see the economy the way Krugman does, and people who think that the incentive effects of tax cuts are provide more stimulus to a troubled economy than spending on public works and transfer payments. This is a basic disagreement, and yet Krugman was absolutely outraged and said basically the assumption underlying his arguments in those days was that no reasonable person could really believe that cutting the capital gains and dividends tax rates would help stimulate the economy and bring it back from a recession, and therefore this can only be the most crass and horrific kind of political opportunism, using a national tragedy to enrich your corporate crony friends. And if you really see what the president was doing after 9/11 on tax policy through that lens, then you would be right to be as outraged as Krugman was. And I think that's when the kind of strident persona that we all know and love today really hardened, and it kind of like I said, predated the administration's case for war in Iraq.
Well, so let me. There was something you said in your first set of comments I wanted to respond to, but let me take this. I actually think. So I think put it. I mean, yes, I think maybe that was radicalizing, but I hate to use the word radicalizing. I mean, I think it was frustrating and infuriating to him. I don't actually think that's a very radical view. I mean, I think it's a fairly mainstream view, and that the Bush view is actually the radical view. That I mean, this is just a long-standing, fairly mainstream view in economics that during a recession, there's sort of two responses. You use monetary policy, obviously, to ease interest rates. And kind of increase demand that way, or there are sort of fiscal transfers that you can do. You can do it through tax cuts, you can do it through spending, but if you do it through tax cuts, you want the tax cuts to go to the people who are in need of money, who are liquidity constrained, as the economists say. And so it's fine to do it with tax cuts, and it may be even desirable in some level because it happens more quickly than spending. But you got to do it with sort of middle class tax cuts, not cutting the capital gains tax and dividend tax cuts. And so I think that was the concern and the frustration, but I think that's a very mainstream economic critique. I mean, Warren Buffett was writing op-eds at the time, making the same point. The dividend tax cut saves me, I don't remember what it was. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, saves me millions and millions of dollars because most of my money comes from dividend income, whereas my secretary gets exactly zero from it, and yet my secretary is the person who is hard up in this recession, not me. So I think the economic logic of that is pretty compelling, and I think it actually is either a radical view or just dishonest to use the recession as a pretext for cutting capital gains and dividend taxes. So I don't think that. I think that was radicalizing in that it was a deep frustration, but I don't think that was like a radical view. I think it's a fairly mainstream view. But
Noam, are you saying that? Hold on, just one second, because I have to respond to that. Are you saying that there were no mainstream economists who thought that cutting taxes on corporate income would reduce the deadweight effect of taxation on economic growth?
That's personal income, right? Capital gains and dividend income. Those are personal. And the argument is that it wouldn't have zero effect. The argument is just that if you're looking for an efficient way to spend government money, which is what we're talking about, are you going to get a bigger bang for your buck on a middle-class tax cut or some kind of spending program that touches middle-class people who are hard up in a recession, or are you going to do it through capital gains and dividend income? And I think it's almost unquestionable that in terms of bang for your buck in a recession, that the middle class, targeting the middle class, is going to be bigger bang for your buck. Now, there are other. It's a perfectly.
But that's not. I mean, that's not almost unquestioned. There are plenty of mainstream economists who disagree with that.
I think you're conflating two things. There's a perfectly reasonable view that says, look, for long-term incentive reasons, it is useful to cut capital gains and useful cut taxes on dividend income because that creates the right incentives, which is the margins, bring capital into the economy and create growth. But I think that's a longer-term proposition. If you're just talking about stimulating the economy in a recession, I think very, very few people, even proponents of capital gains tax cuts and cuts in dividend income, economists who are proponents of them, would say that doesn't give you as big a bang for your buck as a middle-class tax cut or a transfer program that gets money into people's hands fairly efficiently. Now, I mean, again, we can argue about the efficiency of a transfer program or a spending program. I mean, that's certainly a debatable proposition. But in principle, I think that is the argument. I think very few mainstream, PhD economists would dissent from that. Again, there are longer-term supply-side reasons why you might favor.
We might have to link to the petition of economists that Cato circulated during the 2009 stimulus debate, when you had plenty of economists who were signing up and saying this is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. I mean, I think the place where you would have mainstream economists raising questions about this approach is the whole concept of short-term stimulus, and maybe we can use this to segue into an article that you wrote that was posted today.
Before we segue, I just want to touch the very first thing that you said about Krugman. So the CBO stuff. I think that there are two critiques that Krugman was making in 2000 on the tax cuts. And they're distinct critiques, and they're easy to conflate, but I think it's important to keep them separate. One is CBO projections. There was the CBO projected a $4.6 trillion surplus over the next 10 years. No one thought that was right. You know, so you are
except for Democrats who are saying it on the campaign trail today to talk about how Republicans
hang on.
wasted the stimulus. But no, go
let
ahead.
me just take one thing at a time.
Okay.
So no one thought that was true. Even the CBO, if you had asked them, say, look, we don't think it's true. This is just by law the methodology that we have to follow because, as you say, they just extrapolate from current law. They don't anticipate what are almost self-evidently increases in spending that are likely to happen, things that have happened every year from since World War II and are likely to happen the following year. But if they're not current law, they don't put that in. So everyone expected that to be. Everyone thought that was a ridiculously high surplus estimate. Krugman, rightly derided it. I don't begrudge Bush for using it because CPO projections are CPO projections, and that's how you budget using the official budgeting agency's projections. So yeah, I mean, we could argue about whether that was fair or not, but that was only one. It was kind of the portion of his critique that he would almost make in passing. The more relevant critique, I think, is he was arguing that Bush was misrepresenting his own numbers. I mean, Bush would do this thing where he would have $4 on the campaign trail and he'd pull them out and say how he was going to spend them. The $4 represented like a $4 trillion surplus, and tax cuts would be $1 trillion of them, and spending would be another trillion, and then $2 trillion would be for entitlements. And the argument was, no, his tax is actually the tax that he's proposing. If you read his own literature, is much larger than that dollar that he's using to symbolize it on the campaign trail, and the spending conversely is much smaller. And Social Security, his various ideas for Social Security would probably cost more than the $2, the share, that represented by this $2. So there were two separate critiques. One, Bush was just lying, that he was misrepresenting his own number. If you read his numbers carefully, they were different than what he was saying on the campaign trail. And two, that a lot of this stuff was only fiscally possible because of this $4.6 trillion surplus that no one expected. But again, I mean, as you say, politicians do that all the time. I don't think you can hold them to too strictly to that. I mean, it would take a heroically self-disciplined politician to say, I have these ideas, they fit within the surplus CBO is projecting, but I don't really think that's going to materialize, so let's scale them all back 50%. No politician is going to do that. But in terms of representing your own ideas and lying about your own ideas, I think that's a level of mendacity that is fair to point out. And again, that connects back with the earlier critique, which is that this frustration with the media for painting Bush as just moderate, common sense, a couple ticks to the right of Al Gore, worked with all these Democrats in Texas, when in fact what he was proposing was actually pretty radical. And I think Krugman was right to point that out, and I can see how it would be kind of radicalizing.
It didn't seem to me, though, when I read those columns that Krugman wrote where he was criticizing Bush's, look, I mean, that was a bit of political theater. He wasn't going to break out, like, nickels and dimes to talk about, to get the measurements exact. I mean, I think that he, rounded down maybe on the size of the tax cuts and rounded up on the size of his spending. As far as I recall, I mean, they weren't massive misrepresentations of the numbers. I mean, I get what Krugman was saying, but I mean, to act like that is, something to get as outraged by as he did was, I mean, look, I mean, he disagrees with the policy. I think it was fine for him, as I said, like at that time he still. Was kind of writing clever columns and hadn't really hardened. Like I said, I think that happened after 9/11 with the debate over the second round of Bush tax cuts, and we've been over that with just with the idea that if you don't see how any reasonable person can really buy the explanation that they're using to promote their policy, and you think that they're just opportunistically using a tragedy, then you're going to be horrified. Right. But I mean, look, I remember those columns. I just don't. Right, because I mean, like I said, I wish I had. I mean, some at my fingertips here, but I mean, I feel like if I'll send some links to Sang of some relatively mainstream economists, I think, who did not think that the stimulus was a good idea. I think Robert Barrow is one. Look, I think there are several.
I mean, clearly economists who didn't think the stimulus was a good idea. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if you're going to have a stimulus, right, then you want it to get the biggest bang for your buck. And I think most economists would agree if you're going to have a stimulus, if you buy this concept of a stimulus, you're going to get bigger bang for your buck, at least in principle. I mean, the execution can always be botched. With getting money to people, middle-class people or poor and lower middle-class people who are liquidity constrained, income constrained, and that money would go directly into the economy versus cutting taxes on dividend income and capital gains. I don't think that's much in dispute. I mean, the broader concept of a stimulus and whether it's a good idea and whether it's worth running up the deficit in the short term, and there are a variety of other considerations, whether it can actually be executed efficiently. I mean, there's an economist at Chicago, Kevin Murphy, who kind of ideologically eclectic, but probably slightly right of center, who made a kind of cute video presentation that circulated widely on the web about how kind of he was deeply skeptical about basically the execution of it, whether even if these things were true in principle, a lot of this was going to kind of seep out and not get to the people we wanted it to get to and have the effect it would have. And I think that was a more legitimate critique. Let me just raise one other thing about Krugman, which you get into your piece, and I, at the risk of making this an all Krugman thing, there is a kind of endlessly fascinating topic.
Right.
Actually, too. So one other small thing about the CBO. I mean, you made this analogy between the CBO projections when Bush was running and kind of using them as the context for his tax cut, and when Obama and their CBO, they're monkeying around with CBO projections in an attempt to kind of massage things. I mean, I agree with you. Every administration does some amount of teaching to the test or whatever, knowing how CBO is going to score things and trying to manipulate things so they get the best score. I mean, I think that's unquestionable. But on CBO projections, actually, there's a difference between healthcare and tax cuts. CBO is actually pretty good at scoring tax cuts. Just this is the loss to GDP. I mean, I'm sorry, this is the loss to the federal budget over 10 years as a result of this tax cut. It turns out the record on spending is much worse, and particularly on savings through new programs. The former administrator of what was then called HICFA, Medicare and Medicaid, during the healthcare debate, a guy named Bruce Vladeck wrote an op-ed, I think it was in the Hill, and he pointed out that if you look at CBO projections for cost savings on healthcare over the previous 20 years, they're just outstandingly bad. They're always too pessimistic about cost savings. I think he used the example of the Balanced Budget Act in 1997, which they said would basically save half as much money as it ended up saving. So they were off by 100% on that. And then even Bush's Medicare, on the spending side, on Bush's Medicare prescription drug program, they estimated that it would cost about a third more than it actually ended up costing. So they understate savings and overstate costs when it comes to these programs. And so I think you could actually make a case that, that when it came to Obama and healthcare, the CBO was way too hard on them, at least on the cost-saving side. I mean, there were some real, as Peter Orszag would say, game changers, which they gave them almost no credit for. Now, they may or may not materialize, but I think CBO's, the point is that CBO's orientation is to be extremely conservative on that stuff. And so I don't think it's a perfect analogy between the way they score tax cuts and the way they score a new entitlement like healthcare.
But that's only one. That's only one of the many ways in which the CBO score for the Affordable Care Act was gamed. I mean, and that's not really a method in which it was gamed. I mean, you're just talking about the likelihood of various estimates actually
Right.
materializing, actually coming true.
Right. I'm saying
I think I was more talking
that
about
pushing
pushing the cost of the program out. And counting revenue for the full 10-year window. I mean that in order to get a deficit neutral score, I think was particularly considering how important that was to the Blue Dogs who ended up being the decisive votes in the House. I mean,
that is true, but they also got the right score for the second decade, which you can't do that with the second decade of the program.
Well, I mean, at that point, we're talking about two decades from now. That's
no, we're talking where it starts in 10 years, not.
Right. We're talking about the second decade of the program, which I think if you go back and look at the CBO's ability to make estimates on any, 11 to 19 years out, I don't think you're going to see a lot of accuracy there. And I mean, the CBO would be the first to acknowledge that and actually said, quite candidly in their report, that we were asked to do estimates on the second 10-year window, and we're only providing them because we were asked. But honestly, we have to provide the caveat that we have no idea. It's like when we're estimating that far out, it's really, really, really hard to know anything
the
at all.
track record would suggest that they're almost always too conservative when they do that. I mean, they very explicitly rejected a lot of the ideas that the administration thought wouldn't even begin to pay dividends until that second decade. And they may not have been wrong to do that, but I think you just have to understand their methodology is that they tend to err on the side of being more skeptical that things like cost savings can materialize.
Sure, right. I mean that's true. But then we could go around and round because there's the excise tax on high cost healthcare plans that the Democrats didn't really have the courage to include in the 10-year window. They're assuming that after 10 years that will take effect. If you'd asked CBO to score this decade that we're presently in, they would have assumed the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, most of which are likely to be reauthorized. And so I think that you're making a whole lot of assumptions once you get that far out, and I just don't think there's any way to be shocked and appalled at the way that Bush used the CBO, and then also completely forbearing of everything that went on with the CBO and the Affordable Care Act. And as far as Bush's whole stump speech with the dollar bills, there was also a lot of misrepresentation that Obama did on the health care bill. I think keep the plan you have is going to be one of the more unfortunate bits of political rhetoric in terms of coming back to haunt the person who said it.
All right. Well, yeah. Let's move on a bit. And this is mostly my doing, but we have talked a lot of Krugman and a lot of CBO, probably maybe more than our viewerships.
Well, this will be one of the very first. Maybe this will be like a film day in Krugmanology class, decades and decades from now. They'll have. We're gonna show a film today here. Two writers drone on and on about Krugman, but I mean, it's an interesting topic. I mean, because, like I said, I think he's lost influence and traction among policymakers at this point, simply because whether or not they would like to take his advice, the political ground has shifted. But for the first, I think. Few months of the Obama administration, he was possibly the most influential pundit in the country.
I think that's right.
And so,
I think their view of him is interesting. I think on the one hand, they think he was just dead wrong about nationalization, and I think there's decent evidence that he was wrong about it. I say that as someone who at the time thought nationalization may be something they need to do.
I did too, by the way. No, you might be surprised to know that was one of the rare occasions when I thought he was absolutely right, and I continue to think that he probably had a point. You may have changed your mind, and I can't say with any confidence because neither of us was running the FDIC at the time. But at the same time, I thought that the columns that he wrote during those months on that topic made a whole lot of sense.
They made a lot of sense to me, and I think you have to give them, the way they did it sort of worked for the moment. Obviously we don't know the final word on it, but for whether it was right or wrong, I mean, they do, I think he was just, the internal view in the Obama administration is just that he was way off target there, preposterously off target and impractical, and that kind of renders a lot of what he says, less credible. On the other hand, they still sort of bow before his influence. Whenever they're getting ready to release a new policy, they're always sort of stealing themselves for this Krugman column, that follows.
Right.
So it's a weird ambivalence, I think, that they have toward him. They recognize that he's still fairly influential, at least among certain constituencies that are important to them. On the other hand, they think he was sort of way off on one big thing. I mean, the other thing, I think you would find a lot of people within the administration who, grudgingly or maybe not so grudgingly accept his analysis of the stimulus as just being too small. Abstracting from the debate that we were having earlier about whether it was effective and stimulus generally is effective, I mean, I do think they would probably grudgingly concede that he was right and just say that the politics made it impossible to get something bigger. So it is, their thoughts on him are sort of interesting and somewhat textured.
Well, and you have way better sources in the administration than I do, and so I'm going to concede to you on that. But I will say that the more cynical view from the outside, and this really gets into speculation, so it should be taken with a huge grain of salt, is that they find him useful when the policies that he's advocating are things that they want to do anyway. Like they wanted to spend a lot of money in ways that would please the public sector unions, which would not have to endure layoffs, transfer programs that are generally popular with the Democratic base, green energy spending, infrastructure projects, weatherization, things that are that have constituencies that we're expecting to be rewarded for their support of the Democrats in the 2008 cycle. So, I think the stimulus is something that they wanted to do, and they were happy to have such a prestigious backer in the punditocracy and in academia. But I don't think that there was any appetite at all for bank nationalization, for essentially, and I don't like that word because it's what the FDIC does routinely with smaller institutions. But we do have a mechanism in place for that. The FDIC just was blinking at an incredibly fast rate, and they didn't want to do that. Even though if we are in a balance sheet recession, and hopefully now we can segue into your very good piece today on Richard Koo, then what you want to do is clean out all of the bad debt that is clogging the system, because it's that debt overhang that is really impeding the economy's recovery. I subscribe to that view, although I do not subscribe to Richard Koo's prescriptions on endless rounds of fiscal stimulus, and I don't think that Japan really has much to show from their experiments in that regard, except for a 200% debt to GDP ratio and a whole lot of really smart hedge fund guys betting that they're going to experience a fiscal collapse. I don't want that to be us, and so I would disagree with Koo's prescription. But I think at the same time that is the model that we should be operating under and thinking about and having debates in, rather than this sort of other kind of cyclical view of recession and recovery.
Yeah, so we should just explain the Koo thesis to.
Please do. Yeah.
Koo's idea is basically that in the run up to a crash in the bubble. You have how asset prices increase very quickly and to dizzying heights. Values of people's homes and their stock portfolios, and at the same time they take on a ton of debt, and the debt feels manageable as long as the asset prices are high, and this was true in Japan in the late 80s. In the U.S. in the late 20s and certainly in the last decade in the run-up to our own financial crisis. But then as soon as you have the crisis, asset prices plummet, and all you're left with is this huge amount of debt. And so you end up being basically highly leveraged. You may have been highly leveraged before, but now you have a huge amount of debt, in our case sort of a historically high amount of debt, and very few assets that can kind of support that. And so both in financial terms and kind of psychological terms, you're kind of at the end of your tether. You just feel like you can't take on another cent of debt until you make some progress winnowing down the pile that that the recent boom and bust has left you has stuck you with. And Koo argues that basically you just have to go through that deleveraging process, that process of paying down debt, which can often take years because the overhang is so large, until you're ready to kind of start consuming again and borrowing again and doing the things that kind of happen in a healthy economy. And he, basically in Japan, the San Francisco Fed did this study, a quick note that I cite, and actually Krugman has cited before, saying that they went from about whatever, I don't remember what the exact measure of leverage was. I think it was like debt to income or something of like 133%, which was basically meant that there was a third more debt than there was income. I think that was the measure. And it took them all the way, it took them like 10 years to get it down to 1-to-1 ratio instead of a third more. And if you look at that, again, this is the San Francisco Fed, which basically performed a coup kind of analysis. They argue that basically the saving rate has to keep rising from where it is today, and it's about 6% today, until 10%, until it hits 10% in 2018. And 2018 sounds a long way off. And then will be sort of where Japan ended up before, at which point they could sort of start going about, running and making spending decisions the way you would in a normal economy. So it's this huge kind of backlog and overhang of debt that really inhibits the functioning of the economy. And coup, the prescription that you disagree with is, there are basically two ways you can deal with this debt overhang. One, you can just give people money to help them pay it down and to kind of get them through the period where they're paying it down. Or, and I think this is what you were hinting at, or you can just kind of write down a lot of that debt, basically kind of force losses on banks. And just say, look, you're not getting this debt, no one's going to pay it back. And in order for us to make a clean start, we got to just get rid of it. So you just write it off. And that's going to pose a lot of problems for the banks themselves. You may have a bunch of insolvent banks, in which case you have to nationalize them or pump capital into them or whatever. But you're right. I mean, I think there are two ways that you could fix the problem. Coup has one. I've definitely thought, along the lines that you have, that, that nationalization could have been an avenue for doing that. It's a very messy problem, and I don't begrudge the administration for not going that route. But if we are in a kind of balance sheet recession, you're absolutely right that would be the kind of alternative way of getting at it. And it may be that down the road we need to go at this. I mean, I think this summer there was all sorts of speculation that the Obama administration, false as it turned out, but speculation that the Obama would use Fannie and Freddie to kind of bail out homeowners, and mortgage debt being the most significant, portion of debt in the country by a long shot, would use Fannie and Freddie to just kind of do almost a combination of what we're talking about. I mean, they would just, basically bail out the homeowners and help them pay off all this debt.
That's right.
Presumably by just buying all these mortgages and writing them down, and then consumers would then owe just like 30% less or whatever it was.
Right.
So there are a variety of ways you can do this. I don't know if I begrudge the administration for not doing that at the outset. I mean, as I said, I think nationalization is so kind of sloppy and hairy and could lead to some really bad outcomes that I've sort of been persuaded by events and administration people that I'm not sure it was a great option. But what I do think is a possibility is that we are in this world that Coup describes, and that we'll need to do something else about it, whether it's just a lot more stimulus or some big debt write-down. And I'm not convinced that that's the world that we're living in, but I think as you look at the data, you have to kind of allow for that possibility. And we'll know more obviously in the coming quarters. As I said in the piece, there are kind of two models that you can use, and up until this point, they kind of have similar predictions. So it's sort of really tough to say which world we're in. But going forward, the more optimistic model has more optimistic predictions, and so if those don't come to pass, then there's a good chance we're in Richard Cou's world. And if they do come to pass, then there's no then we probably want to sit tight for a bit.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm probably a little bit less agnostic than you in finding myself increasingly persuaded by Richard Cou's thesis, but of the two approaches that you laid out just now, in terms of what should government policy be in Richard Cou's world. Obviously, I think I've gone the opposite direction. I've traveled in the opposite direction from you since February of 2009 in finding myself more and more convinced. And how's this for Unexpected and this particular Blogging Heads TV that Krugman was absolutely right.
Right.
That Krugman was right. The way that he Because, I mean, it's funny, people like Krugman, who have been obsessed with Japan for, 15 years now, and Adam Posen is the same way, their ideology won't permit them to, I think, say that all of the fiscal and monetary expansion was mistaken. But at the same time, they will acknowledge, and Posen will acknowledge and be quite strident about it too, that things did not really turn around for Japan, despite almost a decade of fiscal and monetary stimulus, until in 2002 they installed a new, they installed a new finance minister who got incredibly tough on the bank, forced them to write down a lot of the bad debts that they had just been, in the parlance of today's crisis in the United States, just extending and pretending that one day would be made good. They point to that decision as the real moment when Japan turned around. I mean, I liken it to, in the Middle Ages, when they finally kind of realized that proper sanitation was the way to stop the plague, but they decided that we still need to do religious incantations as well, because we don't know what's really causing it. Maybe it's this hand washing stuff, or maybe it's the religious incantations. I feel like the Keynesian faith is so strong that they think it still needs to be this fiscal expansion. But look, I mean, Japan's in really tough shape. You wrote a good article about Sebastian Malaby's hedge fund book. I don't know if we have a lot of time to talk about that, but if you look at the same guys who were making big wagers against the housing bubble, a lot of those guys have invested in instruments that will rise in value if Japan experiences an interest rate spiral and a major fiscal crisis. And to see us going down the same path really should be, I think, profoundly worrisome, especially when you're contemplating doing more stimulus rather than addressing the real heart of the problem, which is all of this bad debt on the bank's balance sheets.
Yeah, well, a couple things. I mean, one is if you buy the basic, Richard Koo himself says he's not a Keynesian. The story that he is kind of only a Keynesian once you're kind of in the liquidity trap. In this period where interest rates have fallen to zero and still you're no one's taking new loans and using them to purchase things.
Right.
So the idea is. And I think this, I think the Keynes analysis of the liquidity trap, which Koo accepts, is basically right. I mean, if you have basically a situation, and Krugman uses this description a lot, where the world is awash in savings, because no one wants to borrow, that is a highly deflationary world. The money supply contracts. Aggregate demand contracts because you just have all these savings lying around and no one is spending them. No one's using to borrow. No one's borrowing them to invest or to spend, and so the economy contracts. And so however you feel about kind of, in a non-liquidity trap world, whether you should use, kind of Keynesian measures to stimulate the economy and try to manage aggregate demand. I mean, you can set all that aside, but in a liquidity trap, I think there's the logic and the math is pretty straightforward. Is that when no one wants to use these savings, it's a pretty good idea for the government to use those savings, because otherwise the economy is just going to the money supply in the economy is just going to massively contract. And so, I think the reason that, say, the bond market is still cutting us a lot of slack is that they realize that we are in this, borderline liquidity trap world. And if you don't have the government borrowing this money and spending it, no one is going to do that. So that, the standard conservative line against this kind of Keynesian management of the economy is if the government borrows the money and spends it, it just crowds out private sector borrowing and spending, which is much more efficient and more productive. And I think that's probably true. I mean, I think the history since World War II is probably true. suggest that that's true. But in a liquidity trap world, the private sector actually doesn't do that. So Ku makes the point repeatedly. Interest rates are incredibly low. Companies could borrow incredibly cheaply to finance investment. Consumers could borrow incredibly cheaply, but they don't because they're all just paying down debt and don't want to take the risk of acquiring new debt. And so, in that world, you kind of have to have the government borrowing and spending because otherwise the economy just contracts into what he calls the sort of depression equilibrium, where where you end up sort of with the kind of massive contraction we got in between 1929 and 1933. So I do think you can sort of reject Keynesianism as a kind of tool of managing the economy in kind of 99% of the time. But when you're in this liquidity trap world, you can't not do that stuff because you just sort of disintegrate into nothing.
Right. What Krugman would call vulgar Keynesianism,
right.
you can reject and still
right.
believe this is the right approach. Look, I mean, I get what you're saying. I think that the idea that there's crowding out in a liquidity trap is one that is overplayed. I think the bigger problem is that people adjust their behavior, not in a perfect Ricardian equivalence kind of way, but do adjust their behavior when they see deficits that truly scare them. And they realize that at a certain point taxes are going to have to go up. Maybe the entitlement programs that they have been thinking will be there for them in retirement aren't going to be, and that would probably cause a lot of people. I think it's caused my family at least to increase saving, which in a Keynesian world is exactly, in a paradox of thrift kind of way, is exactly what you don't want. And so, I mean, what I am concerned about, and again, this is one where you've probably talked to some of the people who are in charge. I haven't, but I don't understand, why don't you just address the source of the problem? If the source of the problem is bad debt, I mean, we're seeing now. I don't know if these all of these loans possibly being put back on right. the bank's right. books. You see the bank shares tanking right. again. It really just drives home the fact that we haven't solved the problem the way that we thought we had. We really just covered it over. And I wish that people like Krugman would spend more time talking about that. Yeah. And Adam Posen would spend more time talking about the 2002 bank reforms in Japan, and a lot less time talking about fiscal stimulus. Maybe they're right, but I think they're focusing on the wrong problem. Particularly when this is an area where I actually agree with them. I'm like, why aren't you still beating these drums? Maybe maybe they've just been convinced that they were wrong. But I think
it's a thorny thing. I mean, there are some days where I think the four biggest banks, maybe the exception of J.P. Morgan, the three of the four biggest banks are like insolvent. And then other days I'm like, profits look good, they're recapitalizing themselves through earnings, and the balance sheets are strengthening. And I feel like I just don't have enough data to know at this point. And that may not be good, because by the time you do have enough data, maybe it's too late. Maybe you should have done it a long time ago. But I really am torn about this. I do think it's possible that we're okay. The banking system is healed, and what they did worked pretty well. I mean, look, I think it worked pretty well in stemming the short-term panic. I mean, I think
right.
that was important, and it succeeded. And I think sometimes people try to move the goalposts, like that we avoided this panic that would have, just led to kind of global apocalyptic meltdown is not nothing.
Right,
so I think
right.
that's a big achievement, and they should get credit for that. But you're right. I mean, long term, we still have this debt issue, and it's a big issue, and it's unclear whether the economy has the capacity to deal with it in a timely way on its own without some more active restructuring. I think that's true. I think we've gone on for almost an hour, and we're at a point where we have you agreeing with Paul Krugman. Maybe that's like the stars have aligned, and we should knock it off there.
I guess so. I don't know if I'll still have a job after this.
Yeah,
this is dangerous territory. But no, that's I think that's a good place to leave it. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that we're both wrong, and that Richard Koo is wrong, and that the optimists that you profile in your piece today are correct, and that none of these worst case scenarios come to pass, so that generations of Krugman scholars can look back on this little episode and laugh.
Well, yeah, that would be would that be the case.
Right.
We could just provide a future, a little comic relief in a future Krugman studies seminar or something.
I think that's
something we can
good.
all aspire to.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Well, it's been great doing this with you. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely, same here, Noam.
All right, take care.
You too.
Bye.